Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Jonathan Chadwick. Jonathan is a theatre director and writer, and currently director of AZ Theatre, working on experimental, international, and community projects. He has directed companies and plays across the UK, including with Theatre Foundry, the Crucible Theatre's Vanguard company, Theatre Royal Stratford East, Glasgow Citizens Theatre, and many others, as well as internationally in Australia, Romania, Canada, the USA, Serbia, and Kosovo. He has written numerous essays and plays on a wide variety of topics, and he has also directed and taught at LAMDA, RADA, and the London Film School, as well as elsewhere. He has long been active in politics, both within the UK and internationally. Jonathan, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
It's a pleasure, Connor. It's good to be here.
Great. So first, I'd like to ask a bit about your background. If you could say a bit about how you were led to the arts, specifically the theater, as well as politics in the context of the period in which you grew up in post-war Britain, and what inspired you to become involved in these things.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult always to know what leads one towards art and creativity as a way of spending one's life, which I think it becomes maybe to do with certain sort of disturbances that happen when you're a child, a feeling that you aren't let into the world and therefore you have to find other strategies in which to adopt in order to be loved and to be accepted. I don't know, but that feeling of being an outsider certainly is a very strong sense of an outsider, not necessarily all the time trying to get in, but that idea of an outsider, of looking from as a distant observer at the things around one, and yet passionately and compassionately as well. But the background is simple. I'm a product of the 1948 Education Act. I mean, I was born in 1949. My mother came from a working class background. She was a hairdresser. She left school when she was 13. My father came from a more middle class background. They met on an airfield in the Midlands during the Second World War. He was teaching people to fly. She was driving. She was a driver. She drove ambulances, heavy goods vehicles and cars, and she was stationed at the same Air Force base that he was, and that's where they met and fell in love, and subsequently had well, the second of his families. But so I was brought up in the world that we kind of know to be a world of increasing optimism, of equality, growing equality even, a world that was figured by the New Deal that happened before the war and was continued after the war in order to countervail the power of the new socialist system that had been so successful as a consequence of the Second World War, or perhaps within the context of the Second World War at any rate. The fact that Russia and Eastern Europe had become socialist countries, and the fact that China in 1948, just before my birth, or actually nearer to my birth, had become a communist country. These massive events meant that the West, the capitalist West, had to adopt and continue to adopt the welfare system until it could find another way of undermining and defeating that world movement, or temporarily defeating that world movement. So that was the world I grew up in, and my dad was in the Air Force still after the war. He became an air traffic controller. So I went to a school in Sussex that was a boarding school because he was stationed in Sussex, and that was a massive injection of culture, because this school, although it was a state school and a comprehensive school and a co-educational school, was run by a man who had enormous breadth of culture, and he really was concerned with teaching about the world from the point of view of feelings, about reciprocity and sensitivity. He was a new educationalist. He was experimental in the way that he went about it, but not just that. Having come from effectively a background that didn't have any kind of significant developed cultural expression, if that's possible. I don't really think that is quite possible, but that didn't have a lot of books in the house, let's put it like that. That there was suddenly an injection of this enormous and highly developed culture from a man who knew about Italian Renaissance painting and the history of science. And so he had a great impact, but also he ran the boarding part of the establishment that he had up as an open and participatory kind of democratic institution as far as he could. He had an idea about a community, and that had an enormous impact on me, an educational community that could bring benefit to the people who were participants in it. And also he was able to bring people from distant places to become boarders. He had relations with London social services and could offer places to people. And this gave the school a kind of international reach as well. It meant that we weren't just restricted to people from England, although mainly the people were British or English, but that gave it a kind of breadth. So the culture that we got was quite broad. It was very oriented towards CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was very oriented towards anti-apartheid, was oriented towards beat poetry, non-conformist literature, was something that one found in the kind of, you know, in the informal circulations that went on in the school. I mean, one of the first influences on me was that of blues music. I mean, I felt an enormous sense of identification with blues music. I think I was dislocated, and I think that the school represents a kind of dislocation from how I was brought up before that. And it was a good dislocation, but nevertheless, it was a dislocation, and it meant that the disturbance that I might have felt as a child continued, and that sense of being kind of misplaced in the world in some kind of way, I think continued, although I was academically, you know, good, and I did well, and you know, got to university and went to Cambridge, which of course is a very privileged place, which had an enormous impact on me as well, because I felt there another sense of both, well, of dislocation and a kind of feeling of being kind of special, really. I think it was a place that made you feel special, but I think over and above that, I think that there was a sort of sense in which I had a very special sense of what was going on there. So that was interesting. But very early in my life, I engaged with artistic practice. And I can remember when I was 13 or 14 reading D.H. Lawrence and being completely astonished at the fact that he could describe movements of feeling that I thought were completely mine, that were my own movements of feeling. And this unlocked me, and I realized that the power of art to unlock and to share was really powerful and considerable, and an enormous power in the world. And every Friday we had play readings at the school, and the ability for a group of people to sit round and read a play and create a complete world, an imaginative world, was also extraordinary, and extraordinary events to taking part in as a growing adolescent, to take part in those kinds of readings. And also the film had an extraordinary film society. So I was watching Antonioni, Bergman, Buñuel, Eisenstein, lots and lots of classic films, De Sica, yes, lots of wonderful and extraordinary films at a very, very early age. And that also had an enormous stimulus on me. It stimulated me. And I thought, this is something that I want to engage in. And to some extent, those experiences of art perhaps meant that I thought the realities that the art presented were realer than the experiences that I was having myself. So there was something slightly kind of perhaps deranged about it, I don't know, but I think that derangement, that unsettlement and disturbance is extremely important. And I can't say that all of these things were attributable to the historic conditions in which we were brought up, but I can remember that communism and socialism were things that we engaged with, talked about, and decided our commitment in respect of at a very early stage, 14, 15. I was engaged with conversations about that. We looked at the divisions in the world. For example, the school went on strike during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that caused, that was in the national press, because there was this small country grammar school where the senior part of the school were demonstrating and walked up to the centre of the town to the War Memorial and had banners and were protesting against the fate, our control over our lives being somehow taken away from us by the international system. So it was, in a way, I think I grew up in a world that was heaving with ideas and with the possibility of personal development. And that, I think, just, there was theatre as well that we engaged in, and we worked, we did productions, and that that consolidated my interest, so that when I left school and between the year between school and university, I decided that was what I was going to pursue. I was going to do theatre. I was going to become a theatre director, and that's what I was able to do. I was fortunate at university. I could do that, and the place afforded the possibility, because the academic demands were so light, that one could just involve oneself in those kinds of projects. So I wrote plays and produced plays at university and at the Edinburgh Festival. This is in the late 60s. But also, I think the other thing that was connecting up with the kind of diversity of the cultural influences that came my way was a kind of sense of justice. I really didn't think the world was organized very well. I had a very distinct feeling that the world was very unjust, and that might have been to do with the kind of class background that I had, but I thought it was unjust, and that meant that I was predisposed not really to either respect or like the people that I considered to be the rulers of that world. The Vietnam War was going on. I remember that I in between school and university, I remember that the pictures of the Biafra War were in the newspapers and on the television. And I remember being absolutely, completely shocked. I couldn't understand why people were doing this. I didn't understand what we were doing as human beings. And I felt a kind of sense of distance from the structures that existed around me. And at the same time, I remember that I was reading Sartre, would you believe, and involving myself in philosophical reading, because it was a way of trying to understand what on earth was going on. So I remember at the same time as seeing those images very, very clearly, I remember reading Sartre's Problems of Methods, which is a part of his critique of dialectical reason. And it sort of crashing in on me that the world was out of joint. And that's what really sent me, I think, towards reading Marx and trying to engage with another way of thinking about the world than the one that seemed to be obviously laid out in front of me. I didn't accept what was laid out in front of me. And, you know, there were obviously powerful influences like Bob Dylan's songs about God on our side, and how God always seemed to be on the side of the people that were in a winning position in any conflict. But, you know, there were verses like I've learned to hate the Russians throughout my whole life, to hate them and fear them, to run and to hide and to do it all bravely because God's on our side. And I took that as being, yes, that's interesting. That's a thought. What are these prejudices that we're growing up with? What are they made of? And I really didn't want to feel a part of them, and I didn't feel a part of them. So I was that led to my distance from the establishment. So that was the war that influenced me, I suppose, from lots of points of view. And of course, as the decades wore on at the end of the 60s and into the 70s, other things were certainly happening and shaping what happened to me as a consequence of my going out to work in that field.
Mm. The sense that I'm getting is that the artistic dimension that you were engaging with, the cultural dimension of things, as you said, the philosophical, the questioning, and the political developments of the time were all very interwoven and mutually influencing of one another for you in this period. And I'm wondering, as well as in this period, as well as when time goes on through the 70s, the 80s, and you were working in theater, how does the developments of the world, your political outlook, influence your artistic direction, and what sort of plays you would direct or write, and vice versa?
I think that's that I set out to produce plays. The first play that I wrote was about Jan Palach and the invasion of Czechoslovakia and his self-immolation and suicide, public suicide in Czechoslovakia. I was interested in protest. I was interested in the world, and I thought that as an artist I could do that kind of work, and I could raise questions, and I could use art in that way. Very early on, after I left university, I was involved in the Berwick Street Film Collective, and we were filming in Northern Ireland, and we were at the demonstration in Derry in January of 1972, when the British Army opened fire on the crowd, the day that was called Bloody Sunday. And I think that if I'd been predisposed against the ruling elites in this country before that, this experience certainly consolidated and deepened my sense of their vicious rule. And certainly in respect of what was going on in Ireland, that was the case. But that day, when during that demonstration in Derry, I think that it changed me and made me much more committed to social change, and may have also inflected the way that I was going to be producing work. I mean, I was scared, apart from anything else, the feeling of being in a large group of people and knowing that you're being fired at. I was scared, and it made me, that was very, very stimulating sense of what the world was really like and what that struggle was like. So it was an experience of political struggle that was very vivid. And also we were there, I was there with a group of people that came from the Ardoyne in Belfast. I travelled over to Derry that day, and I met some of the people from the party that I came with, and we made our way back after the shooting across over the hill in Derry, down back to the City Hotel, which was where we were supposed to be meeting up in order to take the bus back, and that was in itself an extraordinary experience of understanding what fear was to do with, and how when you met people that you thought were probably more frightened than you were, it sort of lessened your fear. That fear is something that is like an exchange, and that itself was quite extraordinary as a part of the experience. But when we got back to the City Hotel, that was also the place where the film crews met. So the BBC, all the different international and national film crews met at the City Hotel. That was their hotel, and it happened to be where we were meeting in order to go back to Belfast. And the first item on the news was a story about a British Army officer who had died as a consequence of some injury that had been meted out to him presumably by the Irish Republican Army in the days prior to that. The second item was how the British Army had been opened fire on by the IRA, and how it had returned fire and how people had been killed. I mean, it was so blatantly, everybody knew, the news crews, everybody knew that it was a complete lie, that the IRA hadn't opened fire. It was the British Army that had opened fire, and they did so on the basis of a theory that you could read about in the work of Kitson, counterinsurgency operations. You knew that they had an idea about the relationship between armed struggle and civil movements, and that they reckoned that all the people along a certain band who were of a certain age would be, in their theory, members of the IRA, and they shot those people, and they shot them dead and injured some, but didn't injure that many. Most of the people were shot dead. And so the people that I was with, mainly women from Belfast, just completely lost their control and attacked the newsmen. They were mainly men, and I found myself sort of kind of in the middle of this extraordinary event, where I was, I suppose, trying to sort of convince the women that these men, these journalists, weren't the real enemy, and perhaps I might have been right about that, or perhaps I might have been wrong, and that the blame for the story that appeared lay elsewhere. But anyway, it was a very telling moment for me, because I found myself in a particular position between these very angry people and these slightly shocked men from the media, and that also had a big impact on me, exactly what I was doing in that circumstance, where I was. And later on the bus going home, I can remember that one of the women who I was sitting next to told me that I had, well, she said I had the power of the pen and that I could tell the truth. I can't forget that conversation, because it was an important moment of being given a kind of mission, I suppose. And it was later that evening in a Republican club in Belfast when we got back to Belfast and we went to have a drink at a Republican club on the Ardoyne. And I remember buying drinks at the bar, and a woman turning round to me and saying, it must be worse for you because you're English. And I thought that was extraordinary, an extraordinary exchange to have. And that also placed me, both dislocated me and placed me as well, about what struggle was in terms of where I was in the struggle. And I think that I also had a conversation with some young men of my age from the Ardoyne, sitting around, probably drinking beer, and them saying, well, what do you do and I'm not really sure that I had an answer, but I know that that was the moment where I thought, well, you don't you don't go out and get shot. I mean, I thought that was a bad idea, although it's difficult sometimes to know how to prevent that happening. But it did lead to my joining the Communist Party. So from when I got back to what's called laughingly the mainland, I joined the Communist Party, and that was important political commitment, because that commitment lasted for really quite some time. Not as long as the Communist Party lasted, and it didn't last all that long. But I mean, it certainly. I was involved in a local working class area of London in Brent, which still had lots of engineering works. I was the borough organizer. I was active within the Communist Party branch and in the Communist Party as a whole, and became, a member of the editorial staff of Marxism Today. I was fully engaged at a local and at a national and theoretical and intellectual level in the Communist Party as I was producing plays. And the plays that I was producing were Brecht, The Mother. We did the premiere of the Mother at the Half Moon, and then at the Roundhouse, and then I was also working in repertory companies, but also working for touring theatre. We worked on 2 national tours that were financed by the National Union of Mine Workers, and that was in the sort of later part of the 70s. But that work was very, very important, because it was working class audiences, and we were doing plays that were professionally produced in miners' welfare halls and other venues that were organized by the National Union of Mine Workers and us. This was with Foco Novo. And that was an extremely exciting experience, because what I faced when I came back from Northern Ireland, as it were, I was only there a few days, was the fact that the working class were on the move, were in rebellion against the ruling order in the period over the struggle over the Industrial Relations Act in the early 70s. And they tried locking up the leaders of the Dockers Union in Pentonville prison, and because of a mass protest against it, they had to release them. But also there were other massive movements that were going on, but particularly the miners. The miners were at the forefront of that movement. The strikes in 1972 and 1974 were significant confrontations with the government, of course, and of course, Communist Party was deeply involved in the Mine Workers Union, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be in the Communist Party, because I could see that it had connection with the organized working class, and that was important. I mean, the international aspects of it were also very important to me, but that didn't really ring quite as much as the fact that I was involved with people who were militants, industrial militants in the working class. So that underscored the work, the tours that we did, the work that I was aspiring to do, had that in its background. During the 70s, I was working with 784 and other touring companies that were doing the same kind of work, and we were able to do that in the exceptional circumstances that we had, because the Arts Council had a policy of actually backing things that got backing from other sections of the population, and we had backing from working class organizations, and therefore we got Arts Council money as well. So yes, that's what we did. And I was writing plays for those tours, as well as directing them, as well as you know, participating in the companies. And so there was and continued to be a very high level of interconnection between my political views and what I was able to produce. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a smooth road. It was quite a bumpy road, but of course, all of this was leading inexorably up to the major turning point that the election of the Thatcher government represented in 1979. But it wasn't just that. Of course, what we also can now recognize is that the movement of neoliberalism really had set in, and the ruling class had organized itself thoroughly and in depth in order to counter the kind of signs of social movement that they discerned coming out of the 60s and the early 70s. And so that change was a radical shock. By that time, I was associate director at Theatre Royal Stratford East, and I remember that I left there, and I left there as a youngish man who'd had a lot of success in simple terms of getting work as a director, but with a big question on my mind, and that was to do with Leninism, and to do with the version of the world that was stitched into that politics, which I could see was not going to work out quite in the way that I had thought it was going to work out. You know, with the victory of Thatcher, I think I had to deeply reconsider everything, philosophically, politically. I had to rethink what it was that I thought was going on in the world, and that meant, you know, the nature of reality, really. How come that was such a shock? So that started a kind of new movement. I started writing a journal, which I continued to write, that runs to about 55 volumes, in order to try to really explore how my own personal feelings were in some way connected to the historical movements that were happening around me. But of course, I also had to carry on working. I had a child and a young family, and I was still, you know, theatre directing was the way that I could earn my living. So I continued to do that. At each stage, I think that what I was trying to do was try to match what I was doing with what I believed to be important. And I think that at the beginning of the 80s, what impressed me most profoundly was the massive uprising that happened in the cities of this country, and in Manchester, and in Brixton, in London. And this was really, and in Southall, this was the onslaught of the Tory government on the Black population of this country. And that was answered with enormous resistance on the streets. And you can call them riots if you like, but there was an uprising, and that uprising preoccupied me. And as a consequence, I got involved in co-founding a company called Paddington Arts, which was about trying to break down barriers between black and white, between adults and children, and between men and women in a local community in West London. And that led to making television programs called Running Loose. But that organization doesn't exist in quite the same form, but it was a really extraordinary organization that really tried to use the relationship of an inner city to a part of the countryside as a way of stimulating people to create community and to build community. You know, I was working in Sheffield at the Crucible Theatre, and I was able to commission plays. So I was commissioning plays about what had gone on in the uprising of the early part of the 80s. That work, as the Tories and policies began to eat into the arts infrastructure, I found myself a little bit kind of displaced within that, professionally displaced, and I found myself doing quite sort of more international work. As the 80s wore on, I found myself, you know, was a professor at Rice University in Texas. I did productions in Australia and in Canada, connected to a university, but in the context of a festival on Brecht. Those, because of having got a little bit of a reputation, those are the kind of offers that were coming my way, and I took them. They weren't really in the center of what I wanted to do, but they were interesting work to engage with. In a way, the later part of the 80s and the early 90s, I ran a company in the West Midlands called Theatre Foundry, which had an extraordinary remit to provide theatre for what I considered to be a post-industrial community in that northern part of the Birmingham conurbation, and certainly did lots and lots of interesting work. But I don't think I was satisfied. I was looking for something else, but I didn't know what I was looking for. Probably I was looking just for the space to think and read. And it was really in the early 90s that I actually, because of working at drama schools, I was working at LAMDA a lot, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. I ran a course at Mount View in those sort of early years of the 90s after I left the West Midlands. I was looking for an opportunity to read, and it was really at that point that I started to look at the consequences of some of the work that I'd done, but to look at the work of Chris Knight, Blood Relations, the Radical Anthropology group. I started to read at that time. Also, I read other writers that were extremely important to me. I mean, Joseph Campbell's work, very, massively important. And I started to try to think about this issue of social movement once again. During that period of the movement that had happened against the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Soviet Union. I say the movement really, which was the arms buildup that finally, I think, broke the Soviet Union and in a way of making it disintegrate from within. But that also was extremely important. And as the new decade of the 90s opened up and the war on Iraq happened, I think that just added to the kind of questions that were rumbling through my mind about what kind of social movement was going on in the world. And it certainly made me reach for other answers. I could see that the uprising in Palestine in 1987 was an extraordinary and historic event. I kind of followed the Oslo, talks, and I wondered about the establishment of a kind of a sort of proto-state in the Palestinian region. So all of those events were happening around me. I can't say that I was thinking about them coherently. I was trying to work out what was going on, probably at a deeper, at a kind of deeper level of social development than the immediate circumstance in which I was living and working.
Thank you. And you've also long been involved with international politics and global issues. And you mentioned Palestine, which is one you've had a long involvement with. Can you say a bit about how you became involved with international issues? I mean, you've discussed so far your development in a global context, but how you began picking up and becoming involved with global issues, and a bit about the work you have done there.
Okay. I don't think that I really picked up on working on international issues until, and not really, not materially, not actively, until the turn of the following decade, at the beginning, in 2000. It was after the Kosovo intervention in 1999 that, and the beginning of the failure of the Labour government that was elected in 1997, and the clear path that it was laying out for itself to collaborate and to strengthen the neoliberal project, that I started to turn my attention towards international work. I'd worked in other places, but they were all like Australia and Canada and the United States, where the language that I was able to work in was English. And anyway, that was international, but it wasn't really concerned with international issues. At the turn of the century, I decided that I had the freedom, I had the ability to start a project that would engage international companies in exploring, through using workshops and texts and various different kinds of theatrical techniques, the issue of war. And we started a project called War Stories, which engaged with a company in Serbia, a company in Palestine, the company that we currently work with, a company in Algeria, and a company in Italy. Some of those companies, I could bring them together at a theatre festival in Romania that I had close contacts with, because I'd worked in Romania. And I don't mention the fact that I went and worked in Romania and did a production in Romania as a sort of involvement with international issues, although at a very deep level, it was the first production that I did in a foreign language, I think. Obviously it was in Romanian, because I did it for a Romanian theatre. And that certainly did open things up, and being involved in the theatre festival that was based at a town in the northern part of Romania, in Sibiu, and the opportunity that they afforded to bring these companies together from Palestine, Algeria, and from Serbia in the first instance, to address the issue of war. I think that was the first time, that was really the beginning of my attempt to use theatre internationally and to engage with other practices. And that work continued, and we worked in at a theatre festival in Turkey, in Trabzon, and we returned to the festival in Romania. We worked in Belgrade, and we worked in London, and also I worked. I could say we worked, but it was me that was doing the work with the Office of Missing Persons and Forensics in Kosovo, and we were working there with the two communities, the two main communities, because there aren't just two communities there, of course, like everywhere else. There's lots of different communities that had been deprived of the bodies of the people that had been killed in the conflict. So I won't make a full description of that work, but it was very, very important work to me. I was working with both an Albanian speaking company and a Serbian speaking company, and we were producing work for those two communities, the communities of the missing, if you like. And really, really, that did bring me right into the issue of what it meant to have suffered a war and what kind of issues were involved in the grief that might follow that, and what kind of political pickings were there for the political establishments in those places, out of the grief and pain of ordinary people who'd lost their loved ones and hadn't had their bodies returned. I mean, that work was happening as a consequence of the work of the Office of Missing Persons and Forensics. There was a man there who was a Peruvian called Jose Pablo Baraybar, who was the head. He was a physical anthropologist. He was the head of the Office of Missing Persons and Forensics. And he had an idea that using theatre, you could help processes which he described as de-victimizing the victims. That process of defusing, of recognizing people's grief, I think is the mechanism. Recognition, enactment of the stories that people had to tell of their grief. That's the kind of work we were doing. That's very profound work, and we were in a situation where people were, where members of the community were so grateful to the Office of Missing Persons and Forensics and to the teams that were doing it, because they felt that their situation had been recognized. But what we were effectively doing was we were putting their own stories in front of them. We were enacting their own stories. It was a very profound experience for me. And that came out of the Stories project. That was a part of the All Stories project, as well as the productions that we did, and the other workshops that we did, and the international network that we kind of set up. And so that work carried on, and that work is international work. Towards the end of the 2000s, in 2008-9, it was then that I had got to know the Theatre for Everybody company in Gaza. So when I was phoning them up during the attack that was made on Gaza in 2008-9, and I could hear the bombs in the background, and I don't know, something kicked in for me, and I thought, well, I want to continue this collaboration, and that is the birth of that project, which we called Gaza Trauma Long Term, which started in 2008-9, and that has been the most consistent movement of work that we as theatre has done as a company, collaborating at different phases, and we're still collaborating with that company in Gaza. And that came out of that War Stories project. So that's international work. You know, I think that the only other major intervention that I've made in international work, to be a bit careful because I tend to forget some of the things that I've done, but what comes to mind is the work that we did much more recently in 2014 or 15, because we did a stage of work in Yerevan in Armenia and another stage of the work in Istanbul, where we were working at something that actually sounds now quite similar to what we were doing in Kosovo, what I was doing in Kosovo, but we were bringing together artists from Armenia and Turkey and looking at the history of the Anatolian region. So that, I mean, you can already hear, this was in 2014, 2015. One of the people that we were involved in these companies that we were working with was a Kurdish man, Cihan. I remember very clearly. I remember thinking, I knew what was happening in the Kurdish regions. I'd known about it because you know, of my partnership with Maysoon Pachachi. I mean, you know, we'd lived through the Iraq war. I knew about the northern part of Iraq. I even had read pieces of work by Öcalan quite earlier, or at least I'd read articles about him. I'd read that the idea that the PKK had sued for peace. I remember his arrest very clearly. I remember that before that, they had made a declaration about the issue of statehood and whether that was really a very fruitful aim in terms of liberating people from oppression. So already I knew about him, but it really wasn't until I worked on that project, which was called something like Bridges or something rather anodyne, and actually just thought the Kurdish guy knew everything. He knew about the history in a way that the Turkish people and the Armenians did as well, but they knew, I don't know, it was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary experience. And of course, it was at about that time that the work of Öcalan became available. So, I mean, it was a no-brainer. I mean, this connected up very strongly with the earlier work that I'd looked at that was associated with the radical anthropology group. The idea of patriarchy, the idea that somehow you couldn't just talk about the changes that we are going through as an alteration or a change in the capitalist system, that something much more fundamental was going on. And I think that it was this work, the questioning of the nation state, and also, I mean, I was looking at what was going on in Palestine at the same time. So these things came together very strongly in a developed interest in the work of Öcalan, but not just that. In 2008-9, I started another project which was to do with the relationship between the depictions or characterizations of human beings in theatre and in economics. In other words, how did these different disciplines construct a version of the human? And I called together a meeting of theatre workers and economists. I invited economists and theatre workers to come together to talk about it. And this was in 2008 during it was in the foothills, as it were, of the crash. I mean, the crash was happening about our ears as we met. And it was really there that an environmental economist called Paul Eakins mentioned at the end of our discussion quite casually that he was working with data that would every day that would give him to believe that in all probability in 150 years time the earth would be uninhabitable by human beings. And he just said it in such a kind of casual way. I suddenly I stopped. It stopped me in my tracks, the casual nature of the knowledge that was an assumption in his world, which of course I knew about. I knew about climate change. It was 2008. I mean, it had been going on for, at least 20 years by that time. But we knew what was happening, but I had to find out more. And that led me on a strange detour in my life, which took 4 years, where I studied mathematics and I studied economics and I studied environmental sciences and became a master of ecological economics at the University of Leeds. And I, most of that study was to do with the nature of climate change models and how they were composed and what were the factors that were taken into account in the modeling of the changes in these extraordinarily complex natural systems, human natural systems. So I finished that in 2011. So doing this work in 2015, coming across the ideas of Öcalan, recognizing that the issues that we were facing were issues of the dimensions of the species itself, that it was human development, writ large, that we were concerned with. What kind of creatures were we, after all? And how were we going to organize ourselves? These became important questions to me, and I don't quite know how successful I've been in actually finding an artistic way of responding to those kinds of questions, but I've certainly tried to make a profound exploration of them, and it won't kind of be completely out of your attention that also will have led me towards Öcalan's work as well, because of course it's something that for reasons that you know about, and that people who know about the work that he's actually done over the years, particularly in depth while he's been in prison, that's what he's encompassed is that this kind of questions about changes. But not just that. I mean, at the very beginning of my work on ecology, I read Bookchin. So already I'd read Bookchin by the time I suddenly realized what an impact it had had on Abdullah Öcalan's work. So, there was multiple points of entry. There was the issue of women. There was the issue of ecology. I mean, when I say the issue of women, I'm talking about the idea within the radical anthropology group that the initial work of becoming human was the work of human females, and that the original human society gave an absolute priority to the influence and capabilities of human females, and that something then happened in human development that let's say, I think it could be described as a male takeover. And that male takeover is the signature, basically, of our times. It's patriarchy, and capitalism is simply another version of that particular attempt for production dominate reproduction. So yeah, so international issues came also with involvement in that project in Turkey, but also that also brought me into being able to explore more in depth the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan. I don't think, I've got a feeling that his Masked Gods book, which is the first of the manifestos, which is, you know, I mean, you know that it's very, very similar to Joseph Campbell's. I mean, he calls his whole work Mask of the Gods. I mean, it's very much to do with engagement with mythology that Campbell is talking about. So there's that immediate resonance. But I don't think I think those books were probably published in 2014, 2015. So I think at around that time. And I don't think it was long before it had been published that I read it, the first volume. So that's a sort of international issue. But I've leapt on, as you know. I mean, we decided what the kind of questions would be, and we knew that we wanted to talk about how people came into contact with this extraordinary movement that Öcalan is a part of. I mean, and I think it's very important to understand that he's a part of. And it's, of course, it's a Kurdish movement, but I think that we're aware that it's not a movement just for Kurds. It's a human movement, a movement of human understanding that is being undertaken within that context. But everything tells us that there's a consciousness that it isn't based on a kind of ethnic singularity, that it's broader than that. So I think I've a little bit answered the next question. Sorry, but no. It had to happen because as soon as you mention international issues, I think that you know, I can't really think that I could possibly avoid speedily moving towards the influence of that work. Yeah,
I understand, and I appreciate it. And so it is a good segue. I did want to ask you about your thoughts about Öcalan's work, which you have discussed a little bit. I wanted to ask you a bit more as well, what you make of his ideas. As you mentioned before, one question that interested you was the issue of social development beneath the instances that were appearing to you at the time. And that a dimension of his work involves what you could call the philosophy of history, the democratic civilization paradigm, or trying to understand the dynamics of resistance and repression, and understanding how we got here. And from that understanding emerges for the Kurdish movement, this notion of democratic confederalism, this framework of democratic confederalism as an approach to responding to our present predicament. And I'm wondering what you think as well about this idea of democratic confederalism, self-determination against the nation state, as well as what they have, the project in practice as it is going, most notably in Syria, but in Turkey and Iraq as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a bit ignorant about the practice. I keep up as much as I'm able to about what's going on and talk to people as I can, but I've not been there and I don't know about it. But I mean, there's a lot of things that are important here. One is that, of course, Öcalan has opened up a field of being able to talk about human history in a particular kind of way. And you would say that that is a kind of questioning or an exploration of a philosophy of history. I mean, the terms of the way in which he's done that, I wouldn't be able to really address, but I know that he has done that, and he's because he's looked at the issue of knowledge and how we know things. And I think that extraordinarily, I mean, because it interests me very, very profoundly, and I've tried to write about it. I've tried to write a play about it. Is that it would be the case that he would be looking at epistemology and looking at the way we know the world and attacking positivism and being able to understand how that positivism is connected to what you might describe as the patriarchal project. I think it's very important to understand the breadth of what he has brought to bear. As for the issues involved in the political theory, I think that because I don't have the practical experience, it's difficult for me really to make a comment on it. I know that there are questions there that I think are absolutely subject to enormous curiosity on my part. But fundamentally, what he seems to me to have done is to be able to say that the development of human society coming from a period where people variously talk about the change that happened from an organic, what might be described as organic society into this sedentary civilizational space that was born in the Neolithic Revolution. And there's various different ways of looking at that. It's by no means a simple process, but he touches on and understands the implications of Bookchin's realization that at the moment where human beings start to look at nature as an object of exploitation, that very moment start to be able to view a human group as being subject to exploitation. Now, that understanding about the way history works and the turn of a particular human society and human organization, it is, in my view, such an amazing insight into the way things work and the way things have to change. Because these things are because what Bookchin is saying is that these things are connected. And I think that what's so extraordinary about Öcalan's work is that he's taken that understanding, if you like, and he's really applied it to the bioregion that he's a part of. He's really looked at it in terms of the history of the Kurdish region, or the region in which the Kurdish people live. And he's really tried to explore how these different forms of rule happened in a very specific space. And I think that the arrival of hierarchical society in the, I suppose you would describe it as that part of the Fertile Crescent, and the way that it happened in that particular place, plus the fact that the Kurdish people have been deprived of a kind of nation state development, as well as him, as it was, deciding with his comrades and colleagues and friends and associates that actually that really isn't the point. The point is not to form a state. You would naturally get to the point of saying, well, what will the political development be? And he seems to me to have really tried to think that through. If sovereignty doesn't exist within a nation state, if sovereignty isn't established in a nation state so that the people who live within the aegis of that nation state become its subjects or its citizens even, then where is sovereignty? And I think that the idea that you have to just simply decentralize, you have to go back to you have to go back to the human individual, you have to go back to the basic human groups in a society and start to understand how they can become the organs, if you like, or the motor is another way of putting it, but the basic movement of self-determination happens from these units. I can't remember quite how he describes them, and it doesn't really matter how he describes them, but what he's trying to indicate is a movement of human development that goes back to this issue of trying to arrive at a way of constructing society from the bottom up. And you know, this is so important to understand what those processes might be. And I think he's somebody that has tried to describe them. And that is what I understand to be the democratic movement that he's outlining when he's talking about confederalism. Because what happens, of course, in that process, well, I don't need to explain it. That's what I understand to be what he's talking about. During the course of the time that I was looking at ecological economics and sustainability and climate change and how human beings were responding to climate change, the most significant idea that I think that I came across was the idea of localism. That above all else was important, but not just from the point of view of democracy, but simply from the point of view of resilience, because it's a proven fact that that we don't just have to deal with mitigating carbon emissions in climate change. We have to make adaptations to the way our human societies are organized. And it's really those adaptations that everything tells us that it must be from the bottom up. It's provable that the societies that are organizing in terms of climate change impacts from the bottom up are, let's say, so much more effective. I can't use a statistic, I don't like them very much, so much more effective than top down. So the human predicament is faced by the need for this renewal of human capability at that level. And I think the politics that Öcalan is outlining is very much engaged with describing how that can happen. So you build confederalism from the bottom up.
Yeah, absolutely. We are this question of adaptation. We find ourselves at this unique point, this unique historical juncture where we face as a species an existential threat of our own making. And so we have really brought and multiple existential threats of our own making. And so we have really brought the question, the challenge of human destiny to ourselves in a historical, material way, if you want to say. So, and you're right, I think that Öcalan is struggling to cultivate a path from his area, from his bioregion, as you said, but from a global perspective, to respond to this moment, to this juncture.
I mean, because the thing that I mean, just taking the cue from his work, I mean, the thing that I've been doing over this last year is really trying to understand where the nation state comes from, because we've got it. We've got it badly here in the West, and we seem to have invented it, and we seem to have managed to spread it quite effectively and quite ruinously and disastrously to the rest of the world. So in a way, I've really tried to look at what that development is, and this will be the subject of another conversation very probably between us, because I think it's very important for people to be able to follow Öcalan's example, not by just saying, oh, he's absolutely right, but actually trying to sort of do what he's done, and that is explore within the bioregion that they are actually in, what are the antecedent political forms that have led to the current, let's call it dilemma or problem that we've got of changing, because we can't change things without understanding them.
Absolutely, and I think it's so right. You say that Öcalan, what is necessary is for others to take up the work for themselves, of a variety of kinds. You know, Öcalan is always very clear when he is writing. He lists out, you know, remaining intellectual or political tasks at this time to do. He always says that this is a first step, a contribution. It's not a final, the final word of the story. You know, so there is a need for us to pick up these questions, these concerns, these challenges from our places, from our times. So very right. But to close, that is all right. I wanted to ask you finally. You signed earlier this year the Artist Declaration for Öcalan's Freedom, along with dozens of other international artists, as part of their Freedom for Öcalan campaign. So I wanted to ask you how you view the significance of this declaration and of this that kind of network that you can say that was established through it. And in this context, this has sort of been the subject of what we have been discussing this entire time, but in this context, say a bit about how you view the relationship between art and politics.
Okay. Well, I think I sign that. There are things that I sign, there are things that I don't sign. I'd like to see Öcalan free. Partly because I think that he's being made too much of a sort of demigod, actually, by being in prison. I think if he was actually out amongst us a little bit, there could be much more of a dialogue with him, and that would enormously enrich us and him. But just from a human point of view, I want him to be free. And to some extent, I want that freedom to be the freedom of his ideas, to become more current in the world, and for it to be for him to be accepted for who he is, not because I want to make him into some kind of cult of the personality or anything, but just because he's a wise man and we need wisdom in these times so badly. So the people that have signed that declaration are people that are in agreement with that, presumably. I mean, the actual statement itself is a good enough statement. It emphasizes the idea of freedom and tries to address the issue of freedom. And you've asked me to look at the relationship between that and art and politics, and I'm not at all sure that I'm able to do that, but I do think it's important to understand this very, very peculiar word that is used such a lot, which is freedom, and what it, you know, what when you sign something, what do you mean? Well, obviously, what does it mean to you when you look at what that word means? And because the statement itself goes on a lot about freedom. I mean, obviously, freedom is freedom from prison in his case. But I've tried to attribute to that freedom of a different sort. I think the first word for freedom in Sumerian language is the return to your mother, and that was to do with the idea of debt bondage and the freedom from debt bondage, and the return to the mother is what was significant about the freedom that you got when you got let off that kind of slavery. And I think that's very significant in symbolic terms of what freedom might mean. Freedom means the freedom to develop. But the point is about human beings, that we become used to the idea that we should be able to develop as individuals. But what we're not so used to is the fact that we can't develop as individuals without others, without the other. And I think that for me, what I feel Öcalan's freedom represents is something that is dialectical, because I think that we need to understand that my liberation and my freedom lies in my recognition of the freedom of the other, that I can't be free unless the other is free. And I think that that freedom, it must be rather like Extinction Rebellion announced at the beginning of its latest action that's thundering around our city at the moment with glorious drumming and extraordinary displays, that it's freedom together, it's co-liberation. And so I think Öcalan's freedom is everybody's freedom. And it's like, I think Mandela said about the Palestinians, that we can't consider ourselves to be free until the Palestinians are free. So this is it, looking at our world and where I am in London, English man, Cambridge educated, able to appear to be quite authoritative about the various things that I think about with a certain kind of assurance and loquacity. It's very important to understand that that idea of freedom is embedded in the imperialist conundrum itself. And it's Marx that pointed out that no country that oppresses another country can itself be free. And I think that that is what we are effectively facing in the West, is that conundrum. And the only way to enlighten it and to break it and to release ourselves, as it were, from the grip of what might be guilt or whatever, or obligation or responsibility, is to start to recognize the other and start to recognize the freedom of the other. And in doing that for Öcalan, I feel as if I'm doing it reflexively. For myself, I want my own freedom as well as Öcalan's freedom.
As the title of a book that was published a couple of years ago, I think very aptly put it, "Your freedom and mine," is exactly the point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, of course, we've raised many deep and large questions, and we could discuss them very much more, and I hope that we will. But I think for now we have run out of time. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Are there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with in closing?
My thoughts entirely are focused on the future conversation we will pursue, Connor. It's great to talk to you. Thank you for your ear, for your listening. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Okay. All the best.
You as well. Bye-bye.